The letter was on the floor when I walked into the apartment, the edges curled from the weight of time, from the moments it had spent waiting in my bag, and now, it lay there like an unspoken truth I wasn't sure I was ready to hear. For weeks, I'd known something was off. The tension between us had been building, like a storm cloud that had been gathering for too long, too quietly. The love that once burned so brightly had turned cold, the embers barely glowing. But even so, I couldn't bring myself to say the words, couldn't bring myself to end it. I didn't know how. But she had. She was always the brave one. Always the one who could speak the things I couldn't. I didn't know where I went wrong. I didn't know when everything started to crumble, but here I was, standing in our apartment, staring at the one thing I hadn't expected, her goodbye. It wasn't supposed to happen this way. I bent down and picked it up, my hands trembling. The envelope was unsealed, the edges just barely hanging on, as if she'd thought about it too much, reconsidered too many times. The way it had dropped, unnoticed in our rush to pack the things we needed before we left for the weekend, it felt almost like fate. Like a sign that maybe, just maybe, I still had a chance to read it before everything was truly over. I wasn't supposed to see this letter, not like this. It wasn't meant for my eyes. It was meant to be her final words, the ones she needed to leave behind in case she didn't have the courage to say them. But now, here I was, holding it in my hands, unable to look away from the tiny imperfections in her handwriting, the slant of the letters like a reflection of her heart, a heart I had come to know better than my own. It was supposed to be the start of a new chapter for us. We were supposed to be starting fresh, finding a way to rekindle what we once had. I had even planned a surprise for her. Dinner, her favorite wine, a playlist we made together years ago. I had hoped it would remind her of the good days, the days when everything felt so simple, so full of promise. But in reality, I knew that the promise had been broken long before I realized it. I looked at the letter again, and my heart clenched in my chest. The words weren't even written yet, she'd started, but never finished. She'd never had the chance. It was all a mess of drafts, half-sentences that didn't make sense. I could tell she had tried to put her thoughts down, tried to make it sound right, but the pain of it all had stopped her. I wanted to be angry. I wanted to scream, to ask her how she could leave me like this, to demand answers. But something in me just wanted to understand. What had happened? What had changed? Was it me? Was it her? Or was it just life, just the slow pull of time dragging us apart, like the tide pulling a boat out to sea? I could almost hear her voice in my head now, the voice that had always soothed me when I was at my lowest. It used to be that the sound of her laughter could lift me from any dark place. But now, all I could hear was silence. The silence between us, the silence that had begun to grow louder with each passing day. I sat down on the couch, the letter still in my hands, my fingers tracing the uneven folds. I wanted to read it so badly, to understand her heart, to know what she had written. But at the same time, I wasn't sure I could handle the truth. I didn't know if I was strong enough for the weight of her goodbye. I had always thought that if the end came, it would be mutual. It would be something we both agreed on, something we could walk away from together. But this felt different. This felt like I was the last to know, like she had already made up her mind long before I could even think to ask. I could hear the sound of keys jingling outside, the door handle turning, and my breath caught in my throat. She was coming back. She hadn't meant to leave it behind, hadn't meant for me to find it, but now I knew. Now, I knew everything. I looked at the letter again, trying to read between the lines, trying to understand her thoughts. It wasn't meant for me. It wasn't supposed to be my farewell. But maybe it was my sign, my wake-up call that I had been too blind to see before. The door opened, and she stepped inside. Her eyes immediately found mine, and for a moment, there was a brief flash of recognition, like she knew exactly what I was holding. A brief flicker of panic in her gaze. She stopped in the doorway, as if uncertain whether to come in or turn back around. I didn't mean for you to see that, she said, her voice soft, like a confession. I couldn't speak right away. I just stared at her, my mind racing, my heart pounding in my chest. I felt like I was drowning, suffocating in the weight of the unspoken. And all I could do was hold the letter between us like a silent accusation. I never wanted to hurt you, she continued, stepping toward me cautiously, her eyes searching mine, trying to find some sign that I wasn't completely lost to her. I wanted to ask her why. I wanted to scream, to demand she tell me what had happened. But the words stuck in my throat. I couldn't get them out. Instead, I just looked down at the paper in my hands, and then back up at her. What happened? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. She shook her head, her lips trembling as she bit back tears. I don't know, Ben. I don't know anymore. I don't know if I'm the same person I was when we first met. And I don't know if you are either. And there it was, the truth, in the simplest of words. We had both changed. We had both grown into people that no longer fit together the way we once did. And that realization hit me harder than any goodbye could have. She stood there for a moment longer, watching me, waiting for me to say something. But I couldn't. I didn't know what to say. Maybe there was nothing left to say. The silence stretched on, heavy and suffocating, as the space between us grew wider. She had written her goodbye, left it behind, and now I had to face the reality of it. But somehow, it didn't feel like the end yet. Not entirely. I still wasn't ready to let go. I don't remember when I stood up. I don't remember how I moved from the couch to the door, but somehow, I found myself outside, leaning against the railing of the balcony. The night was cool, the city lights stretching far and wide beneath me, an expanse of color, noise, and life. But it all felt distant. Distant and wrong. Like I was floating in a haze, disconnected from everything around me. I still held the letter in my hand, crumpled now, the edges soft from the way I had gripped it. The weight of her words, of what they meant, still lingered in my chest, pushing the air out of my lungs. I had always thought that if it came down to this, I'd know. That I'd see the signs, hear the words, feel the change before it happened. But now, standing there, I felt as if I was drowning in confusion. How had I missed this? How had I failed to see what she was trying to say, what she was trying to do? It wasn't just the letter. It wasn't just the goodbye she'd written. It was everything that had come before. The way her eyes had started to drift when she looked at me. The way she'd stopped sharing the small details of her day, the little things we used to talk about, the things that used to make us laugh. The way her touch had begun to feel like an obligation, not an act of love. I had seen it, I had felt it, but I had been too afraid to admit it to myself. She was right, in a way. We weren't the same people we used to be. I wasn't the same man who had wooed her with flowers, with promises of a future that felt both infinite and certain. She wasn't the same woman who had whispered in my ear late at night, telling me things that made my heart race, made me feel like I was the only person in the world who mattered to her. I thought I was strong enough to face the truth, but here I was, standing in the night, holding her goodbye, and I didn't know what to do with it. The sound of footsteps behind me broke the stillness, and I turned to see her standing in the doorway, her face pale, her hair slightly disheveled from the tension in the room. She wasn't looking at me. She was looking at the city below, like she was lost in thought, as if she, too, was searching for something she couldn't find. "I didn't want to leave like this," she said, her voice thin, strained. I felt a knot form in my throat. "Then why did you?" She didn't respond right away. Instead, she stepped closer, her eyes finding mine. "Because I didn't know how to stay." Her words were quiet, but they cut through me, sharp and raw. "I don't think I can be the person you need me to be anymore." I could feel the tremor in her voice. I could see it in the way her hands shook, the way her posture faltered. She was breaking too. She was just as torn up about this as I was. But the reality was there, in her words, in the goodbye she had left for me. It was all too much. "I don't know what to do with this," I said, holding up the letter, my eyes welling with tears I couldn't stop. "I never thought I'd be reading this. I never thought you'd walk away." "I didn't want to," she whispered. "I didn't want to hurt you. But I had to be honest with myself. I had to face the fact that I couldn't keep pretending. I couldn't keep lying to both of us." I blinked rapidly, trying to control the rush of emotion threatening to spill over. "How long, Laura? How long have you felt this way?" Her eyes dropped to the floor, as if ashamed to admit the truth. "A long time," she murmured. "Months, maybe longer. It wasn't something I wanted to face. I kept telling myself it was just a phase, that things would get better, but it didn't." Her words crushed me. Months. All that time I had been blind, hoping things would fix themselves, trying to be the man she needed me to be, and all the while, she had been carrying this weight alone. I felt betrayed, and yet at the same time, I couldn't blame her. I had been so wrapped up in my own insecurities, my own expectations, that I hadn't noticed the cracks forming between us. I hadn't seen the signs, the subtle shifts in her attitude, in her touch, in the way she looked at me. I felt like I was losing her, but worse, I felt like I had lost her long before I even realized it. I wanted to ask her when, exactly, it had started. When had the spark gone out? But I didn't have the courage to hear the answer. It would hurt too much. So instead, I looked down at the letter in my hand, tracing the faint outline of her handwriting with my finger, like that could somehow bring me closer to understanding her. "I'm so sorry," she said, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted to hurt you. I thought I could stay and make it work. But I can't keep pretending anymore." I swallowed hard, my mind racing, trying to find something, anything, to say. But the words wouldn't come. I wanted to scream. I wanted to beg her to stay. I wanted to promise her I would change, that I would do whatever it took to fix this. But deep down, I knew that wouldn't be enough. It never had been. This wasn't just about fixing the things that were broken. It was about the fact that we had changed, that we had grown into two people who no longer fit. It was about the reality that love isn't always enough to hold people together when everything else falls apart. I began, but I couldn't finish the sentence. I didn't know how to explain that I was still in love with her. That I was still willing to fight for us, even if it felt hopeless. I didn't know how to put it into words. Laura stepped closer, her hand reaching out as if to touch my face, but she stopped herself, the hesitation hanging in the air. "I still care about you," she whispered. "But sometimes caring isn't enough." Her fingers brushed against mine, a fleeting touch that felt like a final goodbye. And in that moment, I understood. I understood that love had carried us for a time, but it couldn't save us now. "I don't want to lose you," I said, my voice cracking, but she was already pulling away. "You never really had me, Ben," she said softly. "Not the way you think." And with that, she was gone. The door clicked shut behind her, and the silence in the apartment felt deafening. I stared at the place she had been, trying to hold on to her, trying to make sense of it all, but there was nothing left to hold on to. I was alone. The letter in my hand suddenly felt too heavy, like a weight I couldn't carry anymore. I looked at it one last time, knowing that it was the final thing she would ever leave behind for me. But the truth had already been written in her actions, in her goodbye. The apartment felt colder now that she was gone. I hadn't realized how much of the warmth in the space had come from her presence, the way she filled every corner with laughter, with music, with the smell of her cooking wafting through the air on a lazy Sunday afternoon. But now, all of that was gone, replaced by a suffocating stillness that made it hard to breathe. I sat down on the couch, the letter still clenched in my hands. I didn't know what I was waiting for. Maybe I was waiting for a moment of clarity, some sign that this wasn't real, that this was all some cruel nightmare I would wake up from. But it wasn't a dream. It was real. And every word on that page, every letter she had written, cut deeper than I ever could have expected. I could feel the weight of her absence, and it was suffocating. The letter had been a mess, unfinished, raw, and unpolished. But it was everything she had wanted to say, everything she had been too scared to say to my face. I could tell by the way the words were scattered, incomplete. She had tried to put her feelings into something coherent, but it was impossible. She was breaking just as much as I was. The pain was in every word, every sentence that had begun and then trailed off, as if she had been unsure of whether or not she should go through with it. I reread it again, for what felt like the 100th time. She had told me everything I needed to know, yet nothing at all. There was no definitive reason, no concrete explanation. It was just the truth. We had outgrown each other. We had changed, and what we had once shared, what I had once cherished, was no longer enough. The door slammed open, startling me. I looked up, expecting to see Laura standing there again, ready to take back her words, to tell me it had all been a mistake. But it wasn't her. It was my best friend, Nick, barging in like he always did, without so much as a knock. "Ben, man, what's going on?" He took one look at my face, his eyes narrowing as he stepped closer. "I've been trying to reach you all afternoon. What happened?" He saw the letter in my hand, and his face softened. "Shit. She left, didn't she?" I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My throat was tight, my voice a fragile thing I didn't want to break. "Damn, man. I'm so sorry," Nick said quietly, sitting down beside me. "I didn't want to call, but I could tell something was up when you didn't answer your phone. What happened? Did you guys fight?" I looked down at the letter, unsure of how to respond. "I don't know. It wasn't one thing. It was everything. We just changed. And I didn't see it." Nick didn't say anything for a while. He just sat there, letting the silence hang between us. It was rare for him to be this quiet. Usually, he was the one cracking jokes or offering some kind of distraction, but now, he was trying to process it with me. "You've always known something was off, haven't you?" he asked after a moment, his voice gentle, careful. "You've been holding on for a while now. I could see it. Hell, You told me you were worried about it a few months ago. Maybe even longer than that. I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. The truth was written on my face, in the way I couldn't bring myself to look up at him, in the way I was holding onto that damn letter like it would somehow fix everything. I knew something was wrong, Nick. But I kept hoping things would get better. That if I just loved her more, worked harder, it would be enough, I said, my voice raw. But it wasn't. I was so busy trying to hold on that I didn't realize she was already slipping away. Nick shifted next to me, his hand clapping my back in a way that was meant to be comforting, but only made the pain feel sharper. You know she's not the bad guy here, right? He asked, his voice quieter now. I knew what he meant. Laura hadn't done anything to hurt me intentionally. She hadn't betrayed me. She had just grown, just changed into someone who needed something else, someone who wasn't me anymore. And I hadn't been strong enough to see that. I know, I whispered. I wish I had seen it before. I wish I hadn't been so blind. Nick let out a long breath. You were never blind, man. You just didn't want to see it. You didn't want to admit that it was over. We all do it. We all try to hang on to the things that are already gone. I could feel his words sinking in. They were true. I hadn't wanted to see it. I hadn't wanted to face the fact that the love we once shared wasn't enough to hold us together anymore. Nick's eyes softened, and he leaned back, looking around the apartment as if seeing it through new eyes. I know this sucks, Ben. I'm not gonna lie to you and tell you it's easy. It's not. But you've got to face it, man. You've got to let her go. Not just physically, but mentally, emotionally. Because if you don't, you're never gonna move on. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Let her go. I had been holding on to her for so long, even though she wasn't holding on to me anymore. The realization was brutal, but it was the truth. I couldn't keep clinging to something that had already slipped through my fingers. I looked down at the letter again, the paper crinkling beneath my fingers. I didn't need to read it anymore. I knew what she had written. I knew what she had meant. I don't know how to do that, I said softly, my voice cracking again. You don't have to figure it all out right now, Nick said, his voice firm but kind. Just take it one day at a time. And when you're ready, you'll be able to move on. You've got me, man. You've got your friends. You're not alone in this. I swallowed, trying to push back the knot in my throat. For the first time that night, I felt something other than pain. It wasn't much, but it was something, a small spark of hope in the darkness. I sat there in silence, letting his words sink in, letting the tears I had been holding back finally fall. They weren't just tears for Laura. They were tears for the man I had become, the one who had tried so hard to keep something alive that was already dying. But in that moment, I realized something. It wasn't the end of everything. It wasn't the end of me. It was just the end of us. The days bled into one another in a blur. I couldn't remember what day of the week it was, only that I had to get out of bed each morning, go through the motions, pretend like everything was normal. But nothing was normal. Not anymore. The apartment was quieter, emptier, without Laura's laughter or the soft hum of her presence. It felt hollow, like a space I was only occupying because I had nowhere else to go. Nick's words kept echoing in my mind. Let her go. At first, I didn't know how to do that. Letting go felt like ripping apart something that had been woven so tightly into the fabric of who I was. But every night, as I lay in that too-big bed, I felt the weight of the truth pressing down on me. Laura was never coming back. Not in the way I wanted. Not in the way I needed. But what did that mean for me? If I couldn't keep holding on to her, then who was I? Without us, without the love I thought we had, who was I even supposed to be anymore? I had no answers, only questions that circled endlessly in my mind, like a whirlpool sucking me deeper and deeper. I had tried to reach out to her. Not immediately, no, I had too much pride for that. But a few days after she left, I sent her a text. A simple, stupid message that was supposed to be some form of closure. Are you okay? It was pathetic, I knew that, but it felt necessary. She never responded. I thought that maybe I could try to be friends. Maybe I could convince myself that it was okay for us to stay in each other's lives, that we didn't have to erase everything just because our relationship had ended. I had convinced myself that I could handle it. That I could handle seeing her move on, even though I was still holding on to the remnants of what we had. But when I saw her a week later, it shattered the fragile wall I had built around myself. I was walking through the park near my apartment when I saw her, sitting on the bench, looking exactly the same as I remembered. She hadn't changed. She still had that same peaceful look on her face, that quiet smile she always had when she was lost in thought. But she wasn't alone. He was sitting beside her, tall, with dark hair, wearing a black jacket that looked expensive. His arm was resting on the back of the bench, just close enough to make it obvious that they were together. I stopped in my tracks, unable to move. The moment felt surreal, like the ground had opened up beneath me, and I was falling into a pit that I couldn't escape. She turned her head just then, and her eyes met mine. For a second, everything stopped. The world fell away, and it was just the two of us, her looking at me with that mixture of sadness and hesitation, and me standing there, feeling like I had been punched in the chest. The man beside her looked up too, noticing me for the first time. There was no surprise in his face, no awkwardness. He knew exactly who I was. "Ben," Laura said quietly, her voice soft, almost apologetic. I didn't know what to say. There were a million things running through my mind, but none of them felt right. I could feel the sting of jealousy, the weight of 1,000 unspoken questions pressing down on me. I wanted to ask her about him. I wanted to ask her why she had never mentioned him, why I had never seen it coming. But instead, I did what I had been doing for days, I pretended. I acted like it didn't matter. "I didn't know you were seeing someone," I said, forcing the words out, each one feeling like they were dragging across the floor, scraping against the silence that had built up between us. Laura's face softened, and she glanced over at the man beside her. "Ben, this is Ryan," she said, her voice still calm, still gentle, as if this was just another casual introduction, as if we were still friends. "Ryan, this is Ben." I nodded, my lips pressed tightly together, the weight of the situation sinking in. Ryan reached out his hand, offering me a handshake. "Nice to meet you, man," he said, and I could tell he was trying to sound friendly, but the distance in his eyes told me he wasn't exactly thrilled to be meeting me this way. I wanted to shake his hand. I wanted to show him the same level of politeness, the same level of respect, but all I could do was nod, forcing a tight smile. "Yeah," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "Nice to meet you." And then there was the silence again. The silence that felt louder than any words could. Laura looked at me, but she didn't speak. She didn't know what to say. Neither did I. I couldn't stay there. I couldn't bear it. The image of her sitting beside him, so easily slipping into a life without me, was too much to handle. It made everything that had happened feel even more unreal. She had already moved on, and I was stuck in the past. I was stuck in the fantasy that we could somehow go back, that we could somehow fix everything. But it was over. And seeing them together, seeing how easily she had moved on, was a reminder that I had been living in a lie. "Take care, Laura," I said, turning away before I could say anything else, before the tears that had been threatening to fall finally broke free. I didn't wait for her to respond. I couldn't. I didn't need any more closure. I didn't need any more words. What I needed was to walk away, to let her go, to let myself heal, to finally accept that this chapter was over. The weeks after that encounter felt like an eternity. I tried to numb myself in every way possible, by working long hours, by pushing myself into meaningless tasks, by distracting myself with anything I could find. But nothing worked. The ache in my chest wouldn't go away. It was as if the absence of Laura had carved out a space inside me that I couldn't fill, no matter how hard I tried. I didn't see her again after that day in the park. And I didn't hear from her. I had once believed that time would heal everything, that eventually, the pain would fade and I'd be able to move on. But I was starting to realize that wasn't how it worked. Time didn't heal wounds. It just let them scab over, covering up the hurt, but never really erasing it. I had dinner with Nick a few weeks later, the first time we had hung out without talking about Laura, and I noticed something different in him. He wasn't the same carefree friend I used to know. He was quiet, his eyes often drifting off to something in the distance, and when he spoke, his voice seemed to carry a weight that I hadn't noticed before. There was a certain distance between us now that hadn't been there before. I could see it in the way he looked at me, the way he didn't ask me about how I was really doing. He had his own scars from our friendship with Laura, and he hadn't been able to fully process them either. "Man," Nick said after a long pause, his voice quieter than usual. "I don't want to be that guy, but, are you sure you're okay? Like, really okay?" I stared at him across the table, the tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. I didn't answer right away. I didn't know what to say. No, I wasn't okay. But I couldn't say that. I couldn't put those words into the universe because it felt too real, too final. The truth was, I hadn't been okay for a long time. I hadn't been okay when I first realized we were slipping apart, and I wasn't okay now. "I don't know, man," I said, my voice hoarse. I'm just trying to make it through. Nick looked at me like he could see right through the words I was saying, but he didn't push it. Instead, he nodded and changed the subject, which was both a relief and a curse. It was easier not to talk about it. But the truth was, the more I ignored it, the harder it became to breathe, to live, to even exist. A few days later, I was walking home from work when I passed by the park again. I didn't mean to, but I found myself slowing down as I approached the bench where I had last seen Laura. For some reason, I couldn't stop myself. It felt like my feet had a mind of their own, carrying me closer to the place that had burned me so badly. I told myself I wouldn't go near it. I would keep walking, keep moving forward. But I didn't. I couldn't. There was something about that bench that had been etched into my memory, something about the way it had felt like my life was crumbling the moment I saw her with him. But when I reached the spot, I froze. It wasn't the bench that stopped me. It wasn't the memory that made me hesitate. It was something else. A feeling. A soft voice inside me telling me that maybe it was time to stop running. To stop pretending. She was there. Laura. But she wasn't with him. She was alone. She was sitting on the same bench, her hands folded in her lap, looking at the ground like she was lost in thought. And for the first time in weeks, I felt the rush of something inside me that wasn't pain. It wasn't anger or jealousy. It was something softer. A kind of recognition, like I was seeing her for the first time in a long time. She didn't see me right away. But when she did, she stood up quickly, her expression shifting from surprise to something more complicated, something I couldn't quite read. She didn't look sad. She didn't look relieved. She just looked like she was trying to hold herself together. "Ben," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "Laura," I replied, not knowing what else to say. For a moment, neither of us moved. It was like we were both stuck, unsure of what to do with the space between us, unsure of how to handle this moment that felt so strange, so foreign. "I didn't think I'd see you here," she said, her words soft, almost apologetic. "I didn't mean for you to find me." I nodded, my throat tight. "I wasn't looking for you. But I guess I was." She smiled faintly, but there was no joy in it. Just a quiet acknowledgement that we were both standing here, still dealing with the wreckage of everything that had been. "I'm sorry for how things ended," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "I never wanted to hurt you. I don't know. I had to go. I couldn't stay, not when things were falling apart. I couldn't keep pretending it was okay." I swallowed hard, the emotions I had been trying so desperately to suppress rising to the surface. "I know," I whispered. "I know." There was a long pause between us. The city was busy around us, people walking past, cars driving by, the noise of life continuing as usual. But in that moment, it felt like everything else had stopped. It was just us. And maybe, just maybe, it was the first time in weeks that I could finally say the words I needed to say, the words I hadn't allowed myself to speak until now. "I'm not angry anymore," I said, the truth flowing out of me before I could stop it. "I think I was. For a long time. But I'm not angry anymore, Laura." Her eyes softened, the tension in her shoulders easing. "I'm glad you're not," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been holding on," I confessed, my chest aching as I spoke the words out loud. "Holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. And I don't know how to stop." Laura stepped closer, her presence calming, even if we were still miles apart emotionally. "You will. In time. You will," she said, her voice steady, as if she had already learned it to let go, already learned to move on. And that was it. No dramatic reconciliation. No promises of a second chance. No tears or final goodbyes. Just two people standing in the quiet of the evening, acknowledging that things were over, that it was time to move on. That it was time to heal. I took a deep breath and nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle into me. I wasn't angry anymore. And I wasn't lost in the past, not anymore. I was ready. Ready to let go. "I'll see you around, Laura," I said, my voice finally calm. She smiled, and I saw something like peace in her eyes, something that had been absent the last time we had spoken. "Yeah. See you, Ben." And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally breathe again.